ANA eLearning Academy is brought to you by CDN Graysheet, a trusted source of rare coin and currency valuations since 1963.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today for the ANA eLearning Academy. The ANA would like to thank our partner Graysheet for their support of the ANA's eLearning Academy. Today we have Doug Mudd, who will be presenting on Medieval European Coinage Part 2. If you have any questions during this presentation, please put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I will read them to Doug at the end. You will be muted for this presentation. And without further ado, here's Doug.
Hello everyone, welcome to Medieval European Coinage Part 2. Hopefully you got to see Part 1 last month, but if not, it is recorded and will be on the website at some point. But anyway, essentially what we're doing right now is we're going from the age of Charlemagne through to the end of what's considered the medieval period of world coinage or European coinage in 1496. So basically from the establishment of larger stable kingdoms to roughly the discovery of the New World and the discovery of large silver sources within Europe, or rediscovery, reuse of those sources. With anything of this sort in a short program, the information covered will be of a general nature. We can't cover everything. I can't cover all the details of all this area and time frame in such a short area, but hopefully it will give a good introduction to the coinage of the period and give you something to look at and do further research on or start collecting in. So just to do a little intro reiteration of where medieval coinage starts, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century AD, Western and Central Europe were plunged into the so-called Dark Ages. The economy collapsed and cities and towns shrank or disappeared altogether. Long-distance trade and sophisticated monetized economies were replaced by barter and an agricultural subsistence economy. These changes are all reflected in the coinage. The overall impression is of economic contraction as the unity of the Roman Empire and its institutions was replaced by a fragmented patchwork of barbarian kingdoms, leftover domains of powerful Roman landlords, and simple chaos. Money became scarce and was increasingly limited to one of two denominations in gold, except for in Italy. Well, as Western Europe began to recover economically from the collapse of the empire, limited coinages of gold fractions were replaced by silver pennies based on the old Roman denarius. These coins became the basis for the monetary system introduced by Charlemagne, which became the basis for Central and Western European coinage for the next few centuries, and can still be found today in the words and denomination systems of many of the countries. England with its penny, you've got that going across Europe in different languages of Pfennig and all those. Now, over the course of the 8th century, as the Germanic invaders settled down and stopped migrating and large-scale raiding, they formed kingdoms. Gold became scarcer since there were few sources of gold in Western Europe and Central Europe, and the tribute from the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire disappeared because the Germanic invaders were no longer a threat. They weren't migrating wholesale, they had settled down. At the same time, the Western economy began slowly to recover over the next century and a half, and new silver mines began to be exploited, resulting in the introduction of a new coin, the penny, based on the old Roman denarius. The penny became the characteristic coin of medieval Europe outside of the Byzantine Empire and was to dominate Western European coinage for over 500 years. And here you have two classic examples. Here's one from Mercia in England, one of the four major kingdoms of England at the time, issued by Offa. So it's a nice silver penny with his name, his title. So they're using Latin still. And then in Carolingian France, here's an early example of the pre-reformed silver pennies of Charles the Great, or Charlemagne. And you can see Carolus and then the mint. So now we'll talk about Charlemagne a little bit. Charlemagne was the greatest ruler of the medieval period. Over the course of his long career, he created the most powerful kingdom to be seen in the West since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and set the foundations for the political, economic, social, and legal development of Europe for the next 1,000 years. In 800 AD, Charlemagne was crowned emperor of a newly revived Western Roman Empire by Pope Leo III. This empire, in modified form, became the Holy Roman Empire and was to last in Germany and Central Europe until 1806. So what he managed to do was create a large imperial presence in the Western areas, basically France, Belgium, Luxembourg, into Germany, Switzerland, and parts, northern Italy into central Italy, and to the borders of Spain. By that time, the borders of Spain was occupied by the Moors. And so his predecessors had been instrumental in stopping the Muslim advance into Europe, as had the Byzantines in the East. And here you have the pre-reform coinage again, a different version of the same one with a different mint. And then you have the post-reform coinage, which has a much more regular, sort of clean look to it, and has some imagery associated with it. So here you have Carolus Rex of King Charles. This coinage began the standard that was to be used for centuries of using a cross at the on the obverse and reverse to mark where the writing starts, where the inscription starts. So you see the cross and you read to the right, Charles Rex. And then on the reverse, you see the same thing, the cross, and then it's Palati. I cannot read that. And Carolus, the inscription, the monogram at the center, standing for Charles. And these became very standardized and were issued at many mints throughout the empire, and were copied widely because they represented a very regular, pure standard that was not debased for quite a while. Now, the fact that they issued them at many mints and many different political entities were allowed to issue the coins would eventually cause massive changes, and standards would change across what was the Carolingian Empire over time, as different authorities reacted differently to pressures on debasing the coinage or increasing weights or other things. Now, Charlemagne became the king of the Franks in 768 AD, founding a new dynasty and eventually giving his name to the new age that he inaugurated. At Charlemagne's death, the Frankish kingdom had expanded well into Central Europe and Italy, creating the most powerful single state in Western Europe, rivaling the power and unity of the Byzantine Empire at the time, and changing the course of Western European history. The political and economic stability of the Carolingian Empire created an economic and cultural revival, which unfortunately was cut short by the increasing incursions of the Vikings and the dynastic warfare of Charlemagne's descendants. Sustained recovery from the fall of the Roman Empire was not to start until the 11th century, a full 2 centuries later. But here you get the map where you can see just how much he accomplished in his long reign. And you can also get an idea of just the pressures across the whole region. You had the Byzantines, which were the Eastern Roman Empire. They were faced with the Abbasid Caliphate in the east, where Muslim expansion had basically conquered the eastern parts of the Byzantine Empire and the whole of the Sassanid Empire, the Persian Empire. Plus, they had moved further along North Africa to take the old North African Roman provinces and moved into Spain, which was ruled by the Umayyad Emirate at the time. So this is the situation that we have at 830 AD. Now, the legacy of Charlemagne was that he created a set of permanent kingdoms. When he died, he passed his inheritance onto his three sons. So he created the Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of Lotharingia, and then also the Kingdom of Germany, which would be, it was mixed. There was a Kingdom of Germany, there's Lotharingia in between. The German part included the Kingdom of Italy. Kingdom of Italy would survive, Lotharingia would disappear, and Germany would become closer to what we think of as Germany today. And then other parts broke off over time. So you had the Kingdom of Provence, Kingdom of Burgundy, the County of Aragon, and the Basques in northwestern Spain became independent. Now we're going to talk about the Vikings a little bit. In 787 AD, a new group of barbarians made themselves known to history for the first time, the Vikings. In 793, a group of Vikings from Norway attacked the Abbey of Lindisfarne, famed for its learned community of monks. This is in northeastern England off of Northumbria. Soon, Vikings were raiding all along the coasts of England, Ireland, France, and the Low Countries, inspiring terror and causing chaos wherever they sailed. The Vikings were Scandinavians from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. They perfected new sailing ships and techniques that allowed them to sail the rough northern seas with relative safety, which they did, much to the dismay of the rest of Western Europe. Their raids changed the political and economic map of Europe, hastening the end of the Merovingian kingdom, the predecessor to the Carolingian kingdom of Charlemagne, and permanently altering the course of Irish history, heavily influencing the course of English and Scottish history. The Vikings were not only destructive raiders and pirates, however, they were also bold explorers, traders, and settlers. And as you can see from the map, they expanded well beyond the areas we mentioned. They got as far as Vinland in North America, so it's the northeastern parts of North America around the St. Lawrence and north. And they also settled Iceland and Greenland. They went to the east, primarily the Swedes, where they formed the predecessor to Russia, the Kievan and Novgorodian Rus states, which became Russians. It was a combination of Viking conquerors and the Slavic natives that created this. And they got as far in their trading as the Ural Mountains and as far south as the Caspian Sea down to the southern portions in modern day Iraq and Iran, where there are records of several cities that they raided and pillaged, along with trading relations they had. Interestingly, in the home areas of Denmark and Sweden and Norway, there are trading towns such as Hedeby, where they found in the archaeological digs numbers of coins from the Abbasid Caliphate period. So they were trading and doing piracy as well, but there was significant trade with the east as well as the western areas, and the Vikings were able to go all the way around Spain, so the Atlantic coast of Europe, around Spain through Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean. They've even found Viking graffiti in Egypt on some of the old monuments, including the Sphinx. So they were very good at sailing, and they created a lot of chaos because of their raiding for a large period of time. As I said before, the Carolingian Empire was greatly affected, and part of the reason why it broke up, aside from the empire being divided among the three sons, was the pressures from Viking raids. Here we show a couple examples of their coins. Both of these I thought were interesting because they show you the Vikings they did not have centralized kings at this time. They had a number of smaller kingdoms in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, often very, very small. So the raiders that went out were earls or lower in rank, basically men that were able to convince a group of followers to go with them, and over time would build up an army of hundreds or even thousands of men. But this is a period when armies were very small relative to the ancient period where the Romans could easily put together an army of 30 or 40 or 50,000 men. In the early medieval and the middle of the medieval period, armies of 1,000 were considered quite large during the Viking period. So Anlaf Gufridsson was the ruler in York between 939 and 941, and his brother Ragnald Gufridsson followed in his footsteps from 943 to 44. They both produced pennies. Now, these are interesting because they show Viking themes. The raven was a very popular Viking symbol, and you see that on the left-hand coin of Anlaf. The ravens were a symbol of Odin, the chief Viking god, and they were his messengers and his eyes. He had two that would typically be shown with him as his closest avatars. And on the right, you see a symbol with a leaf symbol at the center, but also on the reverse, you have a raven flag. This is a banner of the type that the Vikings used in battle. It would have a raven in the center, and then a flag with streamers on it in the form of a triangle. So these coins were both issued in the Northumbrian kingdom at the capital of York. But they're standard pennies, and they're copied from the Anglo-Saxon models of the time. We'll take a little stop here to talk about how to read the medieval coins. This is something that's not as simple as earlier or later coins would be, in part because though the legends were in Latin, so it should be fairly familiar. Over the course of the 6th and 7th centuries, the form of the letters changed from the classical Roman types to medieval Gothic types. Now, these Gothic types were different in part because how they were created on the coins. The medieval engravers began to use punches as opposed to what the later Romans had done, where often they would put a very small hole at either end of a letter and then carve the area between, and then carve the straights that way, and then hand carve the curved letters as different parts. Here you actually had a small number of punches. So you'd have a half moon punch, such as you'd see in the Carolus, with two small triangle punches to create the letter. And then you'd have a triangle with a straight punch to create the A, and so on. So you have a creative use of a diamond with a point, so almost like a little nail, and then the curved punch. Two curved punches could make an O, or they make a single O punch, etc. So the look is very different. And as I said earlier, you learn to read these coins by finding where there was a cross in the legend area along the rim, and then going to the right and being able to read the words from there. Spacing was non-existent, and they didn't use any punctuation, so it can be a little bit of a challenge. You have to know some of the words in advance in order to be able to understand what they're saying. Now, we'll go back to the history here. By the end of the 12th century, the Western European economy began to revive to levels not seen since the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Viking threat had receded. The Vikings had conquered some areas, but they were no longer raiding in the ways that they had been earlier. They had settled in England, but the English kingdom had, under Wessex and Alfred the Great, conquered and survived and then conquered, despite very nearly being conquered by the Vikings. The Irish settled down, and the Vikings became part of the Irish political and ethnic scene, and they settled it down into their various kingdoms and counties. Now, coinage began to reflect the revival as demand grew for a more sophisticated coinage system. Coinage also began to be regularly struck for circulation in non-Byzantine Eastern Europe for the first time. So new, larger, and smaller silver coin denominations were created in order to meet the demands of a more sophisticated economy. So you could actually make change and have larger coins for larger transactions. And gold coins were even reintroduced to meet the needs of the greater volume of regional and international trade. A key element of this economic growth was the growing centralization of political power within the established kingdoms and states. Royal governments once again reclaimed the exclusive right to produce coins in France, Spain, and England, among others. As coins became larger and more varied, more elaborate designs and legends were introduced to reflect the growing power and pride of the rulers of the centralized national kingdoms. Coinage once again became an important form of propaganda and focus for national pride, not just a convenient economic tool. So here you see some examples of these coins that start to appear, and we'll go into more details about the different regions. But the Venetian Republic was an earlier beneficiary of the revived economies, and in 1204 it introduced its first large silver coin, the silver grosso, which was basically a 4-penny coin. So it was worth and weighed 4 times as much as the earlier pennies, and reflected the need for larger coins which could be used in larger transactions. And interestingly, they have a design that reflects Byzantine and Western European ideas of coinage. So you have Christ enthroned on the reverse, and on the obverse you have the Saint Mark handing over the banner of Venice to the Duke, or military ruler of Venice. And Venice at this time was interesting because it's a republic not in the way we think of it as a democracy per se, but it did have a senate, and these men were elected by the upper classes to their positions, and they chose a duke from among them to be the ruler. So very much like the old Roman republican system. And on the right, we have an example of the first gold coin to be issued since Roman times in the Western areas, since, well, the early Dark Ages anyway. And here you have the gold Augustalis, produced based on Roman models, but with a different, distinct look to them. And this is introduced by Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, as he was conquering areas in Italy for an area that had recently been under control of the Arabs and was used to gold coinage. Now, this coinage did not take off, but it did last for 30 or 40 years and was the model for subsequent gold coinages in Italy and beyond. Now, new denominations. So new sources of silver in Central Europe and the increasing volume of trade between the Italian city-states and the Middle East and North Africa in the wake of the Crusades provided the raw materials to produce more larger coins in silver and gold. Italy led the way and began introducing new coins during the 12th and 13th centuries, which were to become the standards for international trade for centuries to come. The most important denominations were the silver grosso, or as they were known in England, the groat, and the gold ducat, based on the Venetian gold coins, which had that symbol of the dukes. And so they used the word DUX and called it a ducat, which became the preferred international trade coins of their time and were widely copied throughout Europe and the Middle East. A related development was the reintroduction of fine portraiture on coinage, exemplified by the testone, literally in Italian head, denomination of the 15th century, which features large realistic portraits for the first time since the late 4th century AD. And here you have a range of these coins. So from the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick II, 1236 to 1300, there's a silver grosso, so a groat 4-penny coin, and it has a portrait of Frederick II on it. Not realistic by the standards of the early Roman Empire, but certainly up to the standards of the later Roman Empire. And on the reverse, you have an image of the city. Then we have a later coin with much improved standards of artistic realism from Montferrat in Italy, William II Palaeologus, 1434 to 1518. And here you have him, William, the Margrave of Montferrat, and you have him in his hat and his medieval hairstyle, but a quite realistic portrait. You might actually be able to recognize the young man. He's obviously a fairly young man at this point. On the reverse, you have a medieval introduction of heraldry where shields that combine the arms of various entities, cities and people, which would identify the individual and the city that they ruled on them. So you have the Imperial Eagle at the upper left, you have the symbols for the various parts of the areas that he ruled, which was a new introduction to coinage for that was introduced in the late medieval period, representing the feudal identifiers for various persons and counties, states, and even the kingdom. The next one we have is the Venetian Republic with a gold ducat of Antonio Venier, and you have Christ within a nimbus on the obverse with stars around and holding the Bible. And then on the reverse, you have Saint Mark passing on the standard to the Duke. His name is clearly on there on the right-hand side, Antonio Venier, and Dux Veneti. So he's the Lord of Venice. You can tell Saint Mark because he has a halo around his head, as does Christ on the obverse. Now we go into France. Louis the Pious inherited Charlemagne's empire from his father and divided it into subservient kingdoms among his sons as well. Fratricidal warfare ensued, eventually resulting in the division of the empire into three main parts: Western Francia, which became France; Central Francia, between the Rhine and Rhone rivers; and Eastern Francia, roughly the later Holy Roman Empire. By 888, the divisions had become permanent, and in 987, Hugh Capet founded the Capetian dynasty that was to last until 1328 in Western Francia, and became the founding dynasty of the Kingdom of France as we know it. It was to be followed by the related Valois dynasty to the end of the Middle Ages. And here you have some examples of the coinage of France, which are typical of the types, but France ended up with a large number of different types of coins, and eventually even different standards for different areas. So here you have a silver gros Tournois, so it's a gross based on Tours, the city of Tours, and it's a groat 4-penny coin, and it has 2 lines of inscription on it, identifying the city. And at the center, it's got a cross. Around that, you have the name of the king, Ludovicus Rex, and then you have the messages, Benedictus Saint Sits. I can't read the whole coin right now, but so you have the identifiers of the mint, and also often the money are on the reverse. Here you have Tyrolus, so the Tyrol, and Louis. On the next coin, you have Charles VI on a gold écu à la couronne. Écu à la couronne means basically an écu with a crown on it. So you have the arms of France, the fleur de lis on a shield with a crown above it, symbolizing that it's a royal coinage. And again, you've got the names of the king and messages about where the coin is from and what they ruled, and the support of God for the kingdom. In England, England was divided into several kingdoms throughout the early medieval period. By the 9th century, however, the kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex had become the most powerful, but setbacks due to Viking invasions and internal warfare prevented the creation of a unified kingdom until the advent of Athelstan as king of Wessex and Mercia in 924. Afterwards, Britain was essentially divided between a unified English kingdom, the kingdom of Wessex, the Welsh princes in what is Wales, and the Scottish kingdom. England became a prosperous kingdom, as reflected in the remarkable stability of its coinage throughout the rest of the Middle Ages, despite Norman conquest in 1066 and long periods of warfare in the later period. So English coinage from the 900s on became famous for their quality and stability, to the point where some of their coinage was copied in European settings. Here we have the coinage of Ethelred II, where you have an image of Ethelred at the center, his name and his title, and Anglia. And then on the reverse, you have the moneyer and where it was struck, what mint it was struck at. Then we have a coinage of Edward I, and it's interesting in part because it has a facing portrait, which was a very unusual element to have on medieval coinage, and started to become popular within England and northern France during this period. And then we have a coin of Henry VI. Here's a coin that I particularly like, because this is Henry VI is the son of Henry V. He was heir to the throne of France and England due to Henry V's conquest and the treaty that he signed with the then King of France. And this coinage represents that that merger of the Kingdom of England and France, and the hopes for the English, at least, that this would be anointed by God and become a permanent settlement. So you have the shields of France at the left and England on the right, touching each other with an archangel above blessing the joint agreement that's in the center. On the reverse, you have the symbols of France and England again on either side of a cross. So a very interesting coinage with a lot of political imagery that if you understand what's being shown, gives a clear idea of what was going on at the time. In Spain, the Visigoths had conquered Spain from the Romans, but they were finally crushed by the Muslim invasion of 711 AD. By 715, virtually all of Spain had been conquered except for the small area in the north. Spanish medieval numismatic history combines Western and Islamic coinage traditions. The Muslims of Spain created a vibrant and vigorous culture that would last until Ferdinand and Isabella conquered the last remnant state in 1492. Muslim Spain began as a unified state that eventually broke into smaller kingdoms over the course of several hundred years, while Christian Spain developed from a number of separate kingdoms into two kingdoms, Portugal in the west and a united Spain united into a single kingdom through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. So here you have some of the earlier examples. The Islamic Spain issued coinage such as this, the gold dinar of the Umayyads from the early period, from 715 to 717. The coinage would get a little bit more sophisticated in its quality and calligraphy, but it would follow the Islamic tradition of not using imagery and using a purely calligraphic or written form for its designs. This particular coin is interesting because it combines a Latin inscription on one side with a standard Muslim inscription on the other side. So it's meant for a bilingual audience, essentially. Now, Christian Spain in Valencia, which is one of the small kingdoms, King Martin issued this coin between 1394 and 1410. And here you have another facing portrait. And it's a standard type, so it has the name of the king and what they ruled. And on the reverse, a crown, since he's a king, over the arms of Valencia, which was, I believe, red and white stripes, and the name of the province as well. Then you have a very famous coin here, a gold dobla, or a double excelente in gold, that was issued by Ferdinand and Isabella between 1474 and 1506. And here is another example of a medieval coin that is rich in its imagery and representations. Here you have Ferdinand and Isabella facing each other, symbolizing the unification of their two kingdoms, Castile and Leon, and Valencia. You have their names. They're shown as equals here, and shown as a couple, which is important for this type of imagery. On the reverse, you have an Imperial Eagle, which is signified by the eagle with the halo around its head, and the shield of the new kingdom, the joined kingdom of Spain. So at the upper left, you have Castile and Leon, and at the right, you have Valencia and the other provinces that were part of Isabella's kingdom. A very interesting coin showing the hopes of unification which were realized, and the crown that appears in front of the eagle and above the shield is an imperial crown as opposed to a royal crown. In Germany, the empire created by Charlemagne, it was unified as part of the Frankish Empire, but it broke up fairly soon afterwards into smaller and smaller units. These are areas beyond the Rhine, eastwards to the Elbe, that had never been part of the Roman Empire. Under Charlemagne's successors, this area, including parts of Italy, became the East Frankish Kingdom and eventually formed the core of the new Holy Roman Empire in 962, ruled by Otto I. From the start, Germany was divided into many semi-autonomous political units, including cities, bishoprics, and principalities that could only be controlled by a strong emperor. Many of these issued their own coinage at different times, making the numismatic history of the region particularly difficult and interesting. So there's a huge range of coinage that was issued for hundreds of years past the end of the medieval period. So here are some of the early ones, including a silver penny of Otto III, who ruled the Cologne from 996 to 1002. Here's a very early example of a very nicely done facing portrait, along with the standard sorts of things you expect to see: the name of the king and the location of the mint plus the moneyer. In this case, the reverse has Otto Rex, and you see the well, let's see, what do we have? We have the name of the moneyer there. On the next coin is what is known as a bracteate coin. It's a coin that was struck on one side, leaving a reverse image that's a complete mirror of the obverse image. Now, this is produced by Ruprecht von Kerfort, who was the bishop of Magdeburg from 1260 to 1266. So it's a Moritz Pfennig, which is a variation on the Pfennig that was lighter weight and much thinner, which is how they produce these bracteates. These things would eventually get so thin that they were extremely easy to break, and it's relatively unusual to find later ones that are complete without some breakage on the edges. The imagery was simplified because they were struck on one side only. Then we have, from the Holy Roman Empire as well, in Austria, a coin of Frederick III, a silver kreutzer, from 1488. And you can see it has the Imperial Eagle of Austria, or of the Holy Roman Empire, actually, and an imperial crown above it, and the name of the ruler, and information about the mint as well. It's not quite as in good condition as some of the other ones we've seen, so it's harder to read. In Italy, the fall of the Ostrogothic kingdom resulted in the fragmentation of Italy into a number of competing states for the rest of the Middle Ages. Byzantines, Lombards, Muslims, Normans, Germans, Spaniards, and the French would all compete for power with native Italians for control of the peninsula. This was due to Italy's strategic position at the center of land and sea trade routes across the Mediterranean and along the southern slopes of the Alps, which allowed its merchant city-states, particularly Venice, Genoa, and Florence, to become economic powerhouses and centers of learning and innovation that would eventually give rise to the Renaissance and eventually the end of the Middle Ages. So here you have some of the coins that are associated with the later period. So in Ancona in the 14th century, you have a silver grosso, so this is the 4-penny coin again. And you can see the design is significantly neater and more clean looking than the earlier designs. And it has the standard information that you expect to see for this period, including the name of the moneyer and the town. Actually, not the moneyer, the ruler in this case. Then we have the Duchy of Milan in one of the early, well, early predecessors of the modern period, where you have a very realistic portrait of Maria Sforza Galeazzo and a beautifully rendered helmet with the arms that he wore upon his helmet. So you've got the wings and other symbols of the Sforza Galeazzo clan. You have the symbol of Milan, which is the snake, which is on the shield. And overall, a really very interesting coin with a lot of symbolism relating to who Maria Sforza Galeazzo was, and symbols relating to the city and Duchy of Milan. Genoa, which was one of the major international trading cities, so their reach was well beyond Italy, all the way into the eastern and western parts of the Mediterranean, was also ruled by Sforza Galeazzo at one point. And here you have standard imagery that's associated with the city on a coin that was famous, particularly in the central and western Mediterranean, for a couple of centuries. In Eastern Europe, things remained politically and economically underdeveloped through much of the early Middle Ages. Most coinage needs were met by imports of coins from Byzantium, the Islamic world, or from the Western kingdoms and the Vikings. The economic growth of the West and the spread of Christianity into Eastern Europe, combined with the development of permanent organized kingdoms, created the conditions for the introduction of the first native coinages beginning in the 11th century. So here you have Hungary, which had been conquered by the Magyars, and you see a silver penny under Andreas the First. So Andreas Rex is on the coin, and this is different from the regular series of the Western coinage in that the cross is a guide to the writing as usual, except that they put Rex in front of the name of the king. So it's different than normal. Normally you'd have Andreas Rex, with Rex being the second word. In this case, if you use the cross as a guide, Rex is the first word. And then the money are on the reverse in a central cross. In Poland, John III Romka, from 1293 to 1301, issued the Fortnik, or fourth, and it's using a version of Cyrillic as would appear in the Russian coinages a little earlier, well, around the same time. In Novgorod, you have a silver denga that's issued with a very crude look. This is an early form of wire money that was used for a couple of centuries and widely distributed throughout the Russian domain in the different kingdoms, which are principalities, which became united under Ivan the Terrible and his reign a couple centuries later. And then we come to the end of the Middle Ages. So with the advent of the Renaissance during the 15th century, the Middle Ages drew to a close. Momentous events that marked this change: the end of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, when it was conquered by the Ottoman Turks, which marked the passing of the last vestiges of the ancient world, because the Byzantines considered themselves to be Romans, and were indeed, they showed a continuous political continuity from the ancient world, from the ancient Roman Empire until their period, with a major change of they were speaking Greek by the end. But the passing of the Byzantine Empire was a major world event. And the discovery of the New World in 1492, only 40 years later, began a whole new age of the world, where you have the first glimmerings of globalism, the first appearance of the possibility of an empire that would span the whole world. which became the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese kingdom as well. This fundamentally changed the prospects and outlook of Western Europeans. Numismatically, the accelerating growth of the European economy and the discovery of vast new sources of silver in Central Europe and eventually the New World allowed for the introduction of even larger coins that became the numismatic hallmark of the early modern world and the basis for the first truly global coinage. So these new mines that were discovered in Central Europe and combined with new technology for extracting silver from the ore, meant that it was possible now to make these relatively gigantic coins. Nothing like that had been seen since the large bronze coins of the Roman Empire or the Ptolemaic kingdom in the ancient world. But these were in silver, and they represented a huge amount of money. I mean, these coins were a month's salary or whatever pay for your average person, but they fit the times because they reflected a growing amount of trade and the need for larger coins. There was still a relative shortage of gold, but they also enabled a new type of engraving where all of a sudden you had these giant surfaces, relatively speaking, and the late medieval engravers worked hard to fill those surfaces with new designs and larger elements to the design. So you have full standing figures, you have larger portraits, you have elaboration of designs to include all of the areas that somebody like Sigismund I, the Duke of Tyrol, whose coinage is considered to be among the first of the modern coins. His silver guldenier here is a large size coin, a dollar size coin, and it's got his image and symbols of ruling. So he's got a crown, he's got the scepter, he's got a helmet of the type he would have worn in tournaments. He's wearing armor, and the other symbols around all point to his importance and where he rules. So Sigismund, and he's the Duke of Austria and Tyrol. He's got the shields on the reverse that show all of the different counties, duchies, and other entities that he ruled within his name, that is part of his family inheritance, along with him mounted on a charger with lance, galloping to the right. So a very impressive series of coins that mark the beginning of the modern era in numismatics, with larger coins, more realistic portraiture, more at first dense, complicated portraiture, all designed to celebrate the rulers and the areas that they ruled at the time. With that, I will end the talk, and if anybody has questions, as Logan mentioned, please submit them through the chat. And in the meantime, here we have some references for medieval coinage that you can check out for numismatic purposes from our library. So we have Christian Erslev's Medieval Coins in the Christian Thompson collection, Coins of Medieval Europe, which is a standard for the history. Nicholas Mayhew, a fabulous book on the coinage of France for the Dark Ages to Napoleon. P. Spufford with Money and Its Use in Medieval Europe. Reading Medieval European Coinage, which is an essential work if you want to learn how to read the coins. It shows all the different types of scripts and coinage, so you get a good introduction to how to read them. And Jonathan Williams, editor of Money, A History by St. Martin's Press, which is based on the British Museum exhibit of the 90s, great numismatic exhibit. And then there's some web references. Classical Numismatic Group is a great source for finding images of coins, and almost all of the coins used in this presentation and part one of the presentation come from the cngcoins.com website. I have a great debt that I owe them for the use of the images and the information that they have associated with those images. And then there's a guide of the early medieval and medieval coins, the French and English Royal and Medieval Coins Guide. So hopefully somebody has some questions.
Yeah, we got a couple so far. The dinars of medieval Hungary and the denarii of Italy, seem very tiny, less than a quarter of the size of a silver penny. How were they used in circulation, especially considering most people did not have spectacles?
Yes, glasses did not really appear until about the 1300s, and when they did, they were only used by a very small set of people. But most people, you have to understand, in the medieval period, as with earlier and later, didn't read. So the important thing was to be able to recognize the design or shape and size of a coin. And then when it came to merchants, they would actually weigh the coins on a regular basis to make sure that they were genuine, especially as irregular as some of the medieval coins got. Now, Eastern Europe was economically depressed compared to Western Europe and Italy. So the tendency was for the coinage to be lighter and smaller because they didn't need the larger pieces. The inflation hadn't hit. So that's part of the explanation. It's not necessarily the full thing, but it does come down to people recognize coins based on the symbolism that they saw. And since most couldn't read them, it was necessary basically to make sure the weight was standardized. And if everything was going well, the purity of the silver would be standard as well.
All right, next question. Are the coins featured here available to collectors or only available on a scale to museums? Also, were proof coins in existence at all during the medieval era?
Proof coins were not in existence at all during the medieval era. Proof coins are only really a modern phenomenon. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that proof coins were produced specifically in the way we think of proof. On the other hand, always there have been times when a new coinage is introduced or the king is coming to visit, and the mint would make sure to do an especially nice example of a coin for them. But proof in the sense that we think of it, where you have prepared dies and prepared planchets, really is a much later phenomenon. So they weren't in existence in the medieval period. The capability of doing such a thing at the time was very limited. You see some nicer pieces, but you don't see anything with mirror-like surfaces in the way that there were special coins in the Roman period where you can see especially well-made coins, but they didn't have that capability of doing proof-like finishes. Now, the coins featured here are all available to collectors. CNG is a great resource online where they have regularly had medieval coins available on their auctions, and many of them are very inexpensive compared to even nicer Roman silver coins or later coins. So they are very available. There are some very rare types and very expensive types, but when you're talking about pennies, you can, with the possible exception of an English coinage, which tend to be a little bit more expensive, but the early English period pieces are also very available, but maybe more expensive than what you would find for Italian or French or Central European pieces of the time.
All right, last question. Was the Venetian ducat or the Florence florin more of a standard international trade coin, or was each the standard during different periods?
Repeat that, please. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Was the Was the Venetian ducat or the Florence florin more of a standard international trade coin, or was each the standard during a different period?
They were actually overlapping. The Venetian uh, ducat, which is also the zecchino, was a standard coinage for longer. I mean, it wasn't until Napoleon defeated Venice that the Venetian zecchino ended, but they were using those coins for about 600 years. Mostly they circulated in the eastern regions of the Mediterranean and Europe, though they could be seen in areas, all over, including France. But they tended to be concentrated in the Mediterranean and in the East, whereas the florin was much more common in Germany, Italy, Western Italy, and in Spain and France. You would see more of those and more copies of them in those areas, particularly in Germany and Austria.
All right, that's all of the questions we have today. Thank you all again for joining us for the eLearning Academy, and thank you to Graysheet for their support. Also, thank you to Doug for taking time out of your day to do this for us, and we will hopefully see you guys in the next one. Have a great day.